Welcome back. In this video, I would like to show you some tools that we are going to use for the next few videos, which will be super helpful when it comes to using API calls to websites which have JSON. So we are going to use Mocky in order to create our own JSON response or our own HTTP responses which contain JSON data that we can then use in order to display it in our application. And that can be something like weather, that can be something like the latest results of a sports event, or in general data that you find on the web that is stored in a clean manner. So most of the time it's stored in JSON format or it is stored in XML format. So these are the most common ones. And JSON is really the one also, for example, used at Firebase. So it's going to be super useful to understand what we're going to do in the next few videos. All right, so we are going to use Mocky in order to mock our HTTP responses to test our REST API calls. So we're going to, so to speak, fake an API website, so to speak, which we then can go ahead and use in order to test the whole JSON thing, which then will allow us to apply those same principles to other REST APIs. By the way, REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's an approach to pretty much allow the requesting system to access and manipulate text representations by using a uniform predefined set of stateless operations. Okay, so we can just send some HTTP methods, for example, get, head, post, put, and so forth, and then we get a response based on what we have sent. So the ones that we're going to use is get and post in this video. So get is when you get data from a website, and post is when you send data to a website. So that would be something, for example, when you want to log in. So when you create an application where the user has to log in, you send a post request with the login information of the user. And if you want to get, for example, the weather data, then you would use the get request. So let's generate our custom response. So here you can see there are status codes that we can select. For example, there are plenty of them. So the ones that we're going to use is 200 OK, because that's the one that just says, okay, everything went fine, and you can basically get the data. But otherwise, you can of course see there are plenty of different response codes. For example, 404 is not found. You probably have seen that one before. But then everything with a 4 has something to do with a bad response, and then 2 has usually something to do with a good response. So we're going to use the 200. If you want to know more about the status codes, I would recommend to just look up a whole definition of all the different status codes if you really care. But most of the times it will just be that you get a status code and then you can read about it, what it does, and react accordingly. So for example, if there is no connection, then you might want to let the user know that there is no connection and display it on the screen. All right, so I have a very basic JSON object that I created here, and you can see it starts with the curly brackets. So you need to open a JSON object and close a JSON object with curly brackets. And what I have here is the key value pair of ID and the value of 1. And they're connected by the colon, as you can see here. And then you need to add a comma in order to separate them. So now it knows, okay, this is the first entry and this is going to be the second entry. Now, if you want to go ahead and test that, you can generate your own HTTP response by clicking on this button, and then you will get that link. So let's open that link. So you can see it generated this very clean website, which just has our JSON object here. So I can now copy that and go to the JSON viewer and now paste that in here, and then view that in the viewer. So you can see it's a JSON object which has 2 entries, the ID and the name. And on the right hand side, you can see how it would look like in a table. All right, so we have the name ID and the value of 1. Then we have the name and the value of Dennis. All right, so this is a super simple JSON object. Let's look at a more complicated one. For example, this one here. So I prepared something which is a little more complicated. So you can see it has a message, then a user ID, the name, email, mobile, profile details. As you can see, profile details itself is also a JSON object. So it has another key value pair. Is profile completed is set to true, the rating 4.7. And then we even have a list here. So you can see when you want to use lists, you can use curly brackets, but then each list entry is again a JSON object in this case. Okay, so let's use that and look that up in our JSON viewer. So here, let's view that, and you can see that this JSON object is a lot more complicated. So now we have this message which says you have successfully logged in, the user ID, the name, the email, and so forth. And you can see here on the right hand side, that's how the data will be displayed. So data list, for example, is a ... which means that it contains multiple entries. So this is a list that we have here with 3 JSON objects, which are ID and value. And then the profile details is a JSON object itself. So you can see you can have JSON objects within JSON objects, but you can also have lists within JSON objects which contain JSON objects. All right, so it can be many different combinations and constellations, and that will be super helpful once we get over to using real data, because that's the format in which we get data quite often. So it's not just going to be a JSON object which only contains data in the highest level, but it also has other JSON objects, which then will also be important to read correctly. All right, so this was just a little introduction to JSON, and it will make a lot more sense once we get some more examples and we build our own code, which then will try to access this file here and then read it and then make JSON objects of it, which we then can use. So we're going to see 2 ways to do that. One is the traditional way, which is rather cumbersome, and then one where we will use a third-party library, which is called JSON. So not JSON, but with a G. And that one is super useful and powerful. We're going to see how to use that. And then later on, we will use another tool which will allow us to get the HTTP requests much quicker instead of using this super long code that we will see in the next video. All right, so let's start with that in the next video, where we will see the, let's say, default approach, where you don't use any third-party libraries, and you will see why it's useful to have something else that will help us with that. So a third-party library which will help us with that. All right, so see you in the next one.